I was trying to think what really has been the characteristic experience that could be shared. Every one of us has a unique destiny, and over the course of a lifetime, that destiny becomes more and more manifested in very specific ways, whatever it might be. I did have the good fortune of basically, blank slate would be too big a word, but I met Swami when I was 22, and I was living in ashram just before I turned 24, and I've never done anything else. When people ask me about many different things, I have to just shrug my shoulders and say I never faced those particular challenges. And it wasn't just youth that characterized me, it was a complete inability to find my place in the world and having just simply no idea how I was going to live, because I didn't believe in anything, is actually the only way I can think to put it. Society was positively innocent when I was in my 20s compared to the world that we've come to now all these years later. But even still, I remember a very poignant conversation with my father when I was 18, when I simply explained to him that I was never going to live a life that looked anything like his life, even though I didn't know what I was going to do. So we all are moving according to what the karmic cycle is within us. We wake up to the real potential of life at some point, and whether that's early or late in an incarnation is actually quite incidental. Master tells of one of the disciples who came to him when the woman was in her 80s, and she'd had no spiritual inclination at all, but she met Master and she was so overwhelmed with his consciousness that she became absolutely devoted to the spiritual path, and Master said she was freed in that lifetime. She must have spent all those 80 years working out the rest of her karma so that the scene was blank. I think the first thought that I would offer in terms of how to be a success on the spiritual path, or something that I've learned, is it doesn't happen fast. And it doesn't happen at all in the way that we think it does. I know I've read memoirs too of people who just suddenly sort of wake up and the whole world is different, and they spend 6 weeks in a state of samadhi and then everything has changed after that. I've never met anyone to whom that actually happened. So I know it's a possibility. In fact, back in the very beginning, which was when I was 19 and 20 years old, a few friends and I became part of this small circle of friends of people who are trying very hard to understand the spiritual path, young American, mostly college dropouts. And one of the things we read was that there was 3 ways that enlightenment might come to you. And one of them is that it would come to you while you were asleep. And so we all decided that was the one we wanted. As if we could actually choose, like it was ordering from Amazon. Enlightenment after years of hard tapasya, enlightenment that just comes while you're asleep. Check, I want 2 of the ones that come while you're asleep. But it was charmingly naive, because we also knew that we were just teasing ourselves. But we had no idea at that stage of life just how long and slow genuine spiritual progress actually is. And a lot of times we become confused on the spiritual path, not because we're actually doing anything other than we ought to be doing. It's that we have a false idea in our mind of what it's supposed to be like. And I was never one, for just speaking for myself, and this is something that I've shared with many of you in the discussions we've had until now. Master says that we should, seek God and try to find God in this lifetime. Swami Kriyananda has given satsangs where he says, at the very least, you should become a jivan mukta by the end of your life. Meaning if you can't become perfectly free, at least you should finish all, break the tie between ego and self, and live free even if there is still some lingering karma. I never felt the capacity to hold on to that as a possibility. But I want to make clear also, it wasn't that I ever disbelieved that it would happen. It's just I couldn't project myself into something I couldn't understand. And I always tried, and perhaps this is one of the tips that I would offer, I always tried to keep my feet on the ground, which is every day has its own challenges. And projecting myself into a future when all of these challenges would be finished never made the daily challenges easier for me. What made the daily challenges easier for me was just a relaxation. And a relaxation knowing that somehow, after many, many incarnations, and who knows how many incarnations we've taken, finally, I've had the good karma to have a clue as to what the purpose of life is. And when you think of that by itself, this is a tremendous accomplishment. Just how many people do we all know that when we try to talk to them about what life is really about, they just don't hear it? The Bhagavad Gita talks about it, the gradual stages of awakening. I can't exactly even quote the verse very accurately, but essentially, for many incarnations, nobody ever talks to us about these truths. Then people start talking to us about it, and while they're talking, we just check out completely and don't hear it at all. There's even a stage, and I believe this is in the Gita, where when people talk about these higher truths, we immediately fall asleep. It's just, we just can't hear it, so we just go away. Then we hear it, and in the moment we understand it, but as soon as the conversation stops, it disappears from our consciousness. And in the path, in Swami's autobiography, toward the end of it, he has a chapter about the spiritual family and Master's days. And he has this phrase that gradually the soul develops the ability, the capacity to attract and hold these spiritual ideas. And I always find it interesting that there's two phrases. First you attract it, then you develop the capacity to hold it. And so we may measure our spiritual success in terms of how glorious are our meditations, whether we have visions, whether we see the spiritual eye, whether intuition guides us in all ways. And yes, if it's nice work if you can get it. But the real measure of the spiritual path is simply the awareness within us that there is no other choice in life. When Swami Kriyananda was asked, what is the difference? How do we succeed on the spiritual path? One of the principles that he said was that we understand it's a matter of life or death. It ceases to be a hobby. It becomes simply the definition of who I am. Why am I in this world? What is the measure by which everything is evaluated? My own actions, my observation of other people, my response to them. What am I doing here? And it helps us. There's an interesting piece of advice in Master's lessons about marriage, which I've always thought was extremely charming. He said, first of all, keep pictures in your house of yourselves when you were first married. Remind yourself of who you were and why you came together in the first place. And then he says, and reminisce fondly about your early time together, so that you can always remember and not have the beauty of what you're doing lost in the mundane. All of us know, who are more than 20, all of us know how the flow of life shifts and shifts. And I just always thought that was interesting. But I've also thought of it a great deal, not in terms of human romance, which is simply a reflection of divine romance, but of our relationship with God and Guru, is to think often about what it felt like when you first discovered that life had a purpose. And when you first discovered that there were divine beings who are going to be our friends and who are really going to help us. So I would say one of the things, and this is actually, it's very simple, it's what Keshava was talking about earlier when he was reading us the affirmation, which is we need to become devoted to this path. You know, we use the word devotion, and we think of the word devotion as feeling, as appropriately so, as love, like that. But the word devotion comes from the word devoted. And we are going to be devoted to something in this life. And whether we're going to be devoted to just getting through without it being too terrible, or whether we're going to be devoted to being important in the world, or whatever it might be, it's what we choose to be devoted to that's who we become, what is important to us. And for many of us, and it's profoundly helpful, the reason that the masters come in physical form is to give a tangible place for us to concentrate. Otherwise it gets very abstract. And we may have an impersonal temperament that leads us toward, thinking in terms of the light and all of the more abstract aspects of it. But also when it's personified, when the act of meditation becomes a relationship. And when I would teach our beginning meditation classes, which I did for many years, I would try to think how to win people to what I had found to be the most dynamic way of meditating, of living on the spiritual path. And I would try to express to people that meditation itself, the practice of meditation, which we think of as going inside ourselves, it's a relationship. And one of the dynamic differences about the way that meditation is taught through Ananda, through Master's path of self-realization, is this is not a process of what you might call self-soothing, where we visualize a beach and we imagine the waves and we think of the beautiful clouds. It's not that visualization doesn't help us, because sometimes by creative imagination, and Master says this, that the power to visualize is a great help on the spiritual path, because by creative imagination we can see and experience before we've actually achieved that state of realization. But when we simply create imaginary environments for ourselves, it's using our own energy with concentration and imagination. But what we're doing when we're meditating on this path with these masters is we're actually tuning in to a reality that's actually there. And this is not an imaginary projection of our own. This is a presence that is always waiting for us. And something that I've contemplated increasingly as the years have gone by is the mistaken idea that I and many others hold, that somehow the grace of God, the word is intermittent. It's like the grace of God is flowing and then it's not, and then it's flowing and then it's not, because we experience it as not a constant. We experience it as coming and going and coming and going. So the mind tries to explain all this. And so we decide that, I'm not really worthy. I've done bad things. I'm not good enough. I'm not doing this right. One of the entertaining factors of teaching Meditation 1, level 1, you use the words slightly differently, but beginning classes, is after we've taught people to meditate and they have some experience and they come back, people would often just sort of tell us what their problems were. And one of the most common problem was, I'm sitting to meditate, but I'm worried that I'm not doing it right. And so then instead of actually meditating, one just sits and feels anxious about whether or not one is capable of doing it. And of course, the more worried you are, the less you're able to relax and enjoy. And all of these qualities make our experience of the freedom and joy of our own nature and the omnipresent love of God and gurus, it comes and goes because we are opening and closing our hearts. And so one of the most powerful things we have to understand is we have to really listen to how the masters are described and how they describe themselves. Unconditional, infinite, unchanging, free. And it's not as if the masters sit on the edge and dole out their respect and love for us sort of in little tiny bits, like we have to punch our time card and then get a little bit, a very Vaishya attitude. I pay with kriyas and then I get a little bliss. And if my kriyas are a little crummy and 6 or 7 of them get taken off the picture, then the bliss is a little less. It's actually the true reality of this world. The true reality of this world is an absolute unchanging flow of grace. And what our job is to just remember that. And remember it sufficiently that it transcends all the other memories that compete within us. And this is what happens to all of us, is that we're always in, many different vrittis in our chakras, in our spine, are competing for our attention. Those vrittis are like greedy little mouths, like little birds. You see how birds are in a nest, and their little mouths are wide open, their eyes, they don't have any eyes, and they're just crazy, cheeping, just waiting for something to be dropped into their mouth. I saw a film which may have come to this country, I don't know. It was a documentary about birds. It was called Migration. It was a lovely film. And but the first scene was, I think it's probably a cuckoo bird, but it was some big bird that doesn't bother to raise its own young. It's a very sort of hedonistic little bird. It just gets the egg, but then it deposits its egg in somebody else's nest and then just wanders off and enjoys its freedom. And then that bird grows up in somebody else's nest. Well, this first picture on this film was like 2 or 3 of the little birds like this, and one great big bird that had obviously been deposited by the cuckoo mother or whoever it was. And then the big bird gradually pushed the little birds out of the nest. Just wiped them out, just threw them off the nest, and they probably fell to the ground and died. Then the big bird got all the worms. And the mother bird would come back, I'm sure, a little puzzled, but nonetheless following her path and just feeding that bird. You know what I thought when I saw that? I thought about all the karmic struggles I've had in my life with people who liked me or didn't like me, and people I liked and didn't like. And I thought, oh my gosh, you think it started back then? When the cuckoo bird was I the one who pushed the others out of the nest and they've hated me ever since? Was I the one who was pushed out of the nest, and then ever since then, I have to sort of fight for my place? And whether it's true or not, that's what it feels like, doesn't it? That we're just always caught up. And even though we have this single-pointed aspiration, all these vrittis, like little birds, they're always competing. They're competing for our consciousness. And so our consciousness is just sailing right along, and then one of these vrittis just comes up, and all of a sudden we've gone down the mouth of that whirlpool, and we're just whirling around in it. What we have to understand, and this is a very important point for final success, is that this is just the way it is. This is actually what happens. And our progress spiritually is to fall into these vrittis, to realize that we've gotten ourselves caught in another whirlpool, to remember where we're really trying to go, and then putting out the effort to extricate ourselves once more and to get onto the smoother trajectory. And I don't know anyone whose spiritual life has gone without these ups and downs. And Swami Kriyananda was so authentic with us. It wasn't he manifested this steady commitment that was sort of like a big tree, just rooted deeply in the ground. But that didn't mean that the storms didn't come through the branches. I even remember, very interesting, at the end of his life, toward the end of his life, he was living in Assisi. It was before he came to India, and most of the staff wanted to go on an India pilgrimage, so wanted to come to India. So they decided the whole staff could come, but I went over to Assisi to cook for Swami and to do his secretarial work, and there was one or two others of us who were sort of filling in for everybody else. And I think it was probably toward the time that we'd been through all the litigation where Swami's Gurubhais had been so unkind to him. And Swami was very authentically just lamenting, what life is really like and how heartbreaking it is to live in this world. And there was a time we were actually at some coffee shop in the town, and he just started being very authentic about, just how discouraging it is that even when you try to do good work in the world, you're not always appreciated. And he was being talking about his own experience, but he was also telling me that this is really what happens. To be joyful does not mean that we're always happy. We can be very deeply joyful because out of thousands and thousands, we've been one who was gifted with the opportunity to be on the path, but that doesn't make this world less heartbreaking. And Swamiji, he needed to say it to someone, so he said all of this to me, and he was talking, and I'd learned by this point just to be sympathetic and supportive and to learn what I could and also be a friend to him. And we had this conversation, then we gradually went back to his house, and Swamiji, in his way, just being honest and saying what you really feel. And what I learned from him that day is how one works with these feelings. He didn't pretend for a moment that he didn't feel it. He made no effort to suppress that feeling. I mistakenly thought for a long time in my life that if you just suppressed these feelings, that somehow they would go away. Even in the Gita it says, of what avail suppression? Swami puts it more bluntly. It just comes out in some weird way later. It doesn't really help you. You have to be able to be completely truthful. I'm sad, I'm heartbroken, I'm disappointed. I wish it were different. And then the more that Swami talked, and this is what often happens, the more you just begin to realize, well, this may be true, but there's other realities. And finally, it was almost like he was exaggerating what he felt, because he could see it was also, from a certain perspective, just humorous. That after all the graces that have been given to us, all the wonderful, just simply having found a spiritual path, that everything is unimportant by comparison. And Swamiji also had this way of helping us with our difficult attitudes, which was he would sometimes just exaggerate them so that they became comical rather than not. So we were in his house finally, and he was still sort of in this mood. And I said, well, sir, what can I do to help? And he said, make me a good Indian lunch. He said like that. And then I still didn't go into the kitchen. I was just sitting with him. And he sort of, after a moment, basically said, why aren't you in the kitchen making me a good lunch? And, oh, I know what else happened. When he was talking about that, first I said, sir, I just don't know what to offer you. And he was turning over now into being more lighthearted. I don't know what to offer you, sir, except euthanasia, And he looked at me like, what? And then he realized that I was doing what he trained me to do, which is, well, if life is so bad, why don't we just end it? And then he began to laugh, and that's when he said, no, you can make me a good Indian lunch. And then I still sat there, and he said, why aren't you in the kitchen? I said, well, you have to promise me you won't throw yourself off the balcony if I walk out the door. He said, no, I'm safe. You can go cook for me, and it'll be fine. But isn't that interesting? This is not how you would expect it. And Swami said that even Master, at the end of his life, became a little downhearted because Master had many, many trials, and many people betrayed him. He had 2 different lawsuits from his own disciples trying to get money from him. The first one succeeded, and then Master was very smart and reorganized his organization legally, so the second time it was tried, it didn't work. But your own disciples. Now, I'm not saying this so that we'll just all throw ourselves off the balcony. That's not my intention here. My intention is to say that spiritual life is real life. And if we've come on the spiritual path thinking it's going to be some kind of a free ride, and that we have things that we don't want to face, so we're just going to, quote, give them to God, and then we won't have to deal with our karma anymore, this is not a helpful attitude. The people on the spiritual path, you become very strong. It doesn't make you weak. I learned this lesson in a very fun way. I've always been, I'm not psychic by any means, but I've always been extra sensitive. I have extra nerve endings or something. I don't know what it is. So for many years on the spiritual path, I reveled in my sensitivity. I can't do that because I'm so sensitive. Can't do this because I'm so sensitive. Can't go there because I'm so sensitive. And all of this was making me think that I was more spiritual, not less. Then some of you have heard me say this. I was doing a class with a friend of mine, a man who happened to be about 6'3", big bass voice, really strong body, just big, strong man. We were doing a class on affirmations, and we hadn't planned it out too carefully, except he had the part where he was going to lead the whole group in an affirmation. So we're sitting next to each other in front of a small class in a relatively small room with a real echoey feeling to it. And the affirmation he chose out of Master's book was one, I don't remember the details, but it was one I had never considered. Basically, the words were, I am strong, I am powerful, I am, the biggest force in the universe and nothing can touch me. And I'm sitting next to him. And he starts in with this voice. And just as he's saying these words, I am strong, I am powerful, inside me I'm saying, I am weak, I am tiny. I can go through the waves of life. No, I can't. It was so dramatic to me. And then in that moment, thank you, God, it was a real important moment to me. I thought, what have I been doing all this time? Why have I been thinking that my spiritual life justified my being more and more vulnerable? That would be exactly the opposite of what true spirituality is. It's we live in this world, but we live surrounded by the power and the grace of God, which is always there for us. And I had to just do almost a complete reversal at that point. I didn't give myself a strong man's body, so it was an obvious lesson for me. I have always, until age took over, but I was always physically somewhat strong for my size. But inwardly, I cultivated this sensitivity. Not only did I not try to overcome it, but I cultivated it. Wow, how did that happen? It was ego in the sense of a certain pride, like that. So one of the things that I've also learned is we have to always be willing to stop and think very deeply, why do I believe that? Because sometimes we have certain beliefs, and they're not exactly wrong, but they're not as deep as they should be. And just to always be asking ourselves, when we find ourselves holding forth or defending or explaining or justifying, just to breathe long enough to just ask the simple question, is this really true? How did I come to think this? Such as hard things won't happen to me. If God really loved me, I'm not worthy. Maybe I'm doing the meditation wrong. Why do I think this is true? And over and over and over again, over years, you just realize that wasn't really the right way to behave. And you have to become, it's a paradox. You have to become very determined in what you're doing, and you also have to be completely flexible, that you're just ready as soon as you see that there's another reality that you really understand, that you can just move to that. So the question becomes, what am I really devoted to? When about 1980, Ananda village, we always had trouble developing that property there because our neighbors had come there to just completely drop out of society. They were, at that time, most of the economy was growing illegal marijuana around us, so they had a strong desire to be invisible. You'd walk down a kilometer or two from where Swami Kriyananda's house, and you came to somebody else's land, and it said, no entry without an invitation or a warrant, search warrant, and so our neighbors, and then we came out there, and not only did we have a very different attitude, including that we weren't growing illegal marijuana, but we invited the whole world to come visit us. Far from dropping out, we were advertising everywhere and inviting reporters and county people and people from everywhere. So we were in a little bit of a conflict, and they were always trying to stop us. And the way the land use system worked, protest from local residents could have a very bad effect on our intentions, getting permissions and so on. So it was always a struggle. So we figured out that there was a legal way around it, which is that Ananda village itself could become a California city. At the very end, we started spelling CITYSIDDHI, a California city. But in any case, it was kind of goofy because we were just a 900-acre farm, basically. But technically, you could do it. Law is funny. It's just a matter. So for 18 months, it was my job to work on this. And it was extremely controversial and very dynamic. And every time we had a hearing, it had to be in a bigger local venue. And finally, the last hearing was in this venue that held about 800 people. And everybody was against us except us. And the hearing went on till 2 or 3 in the morning. It was just a big adventure. And then they made a bad decision, and we were going to go to the courts, like this, really make it happen. And I just, for 18 months, it was all that I did. I was totally focused on it. Then Swami just decided, well, what actually happened is I was bringing this television crew from Sacramento, from the state capital, up to see Swami, and we were going to talk about this thing. It was national news, what we were doing. And I brought the reporters in, and all the way to Swami's house, I'm telling them about how this was the wrong decision and we had a right to do this and they didn't right. We're going to go to the courts and it's really going to happen. We get there. There's no telephones at Ananda, you have to understand, at that point. And so we show up, and Swami says to the reporters, he says, if you'll give me a few extra minutes, I have a scoop for you. I'm going to tell you something nobody knows. Jyotish was standing there. I said, Jyotish, what is he going to say? And Jyotish kind of looks a little white, and he says, you don't know? I said, no, I don't know. So then Swami starts reading the statement, and the statement says, it's over, we're finished. We're going to accept the decision, it's done. Right, like this. Then they pivot right over to me with the microphone, and I say, yes, of course, that's what we would do. What else would we do, like this? And then all the way back down the hill, I tell them about how this is the obvious decision. What else would we do? We go back. They're used to interviewing politicians, so it made perfect sense to them. So we get all the way, I say goodbye to them, I get back in my car, I drive back up the hill, and I'm just like, what? I'm just Swamiji, like, what? What? And he's so cute. He sort of pats me on the head. He said, I'm sorry, there was no way to let you know in advance like this. I said, what happened? He said, I was meditating and I asked Master what we should do. And he said, no, it's the right decision. You really don't want to. You don't want to make a legal entity. He had all these other reasons. But he said, no, I just felt Master say it wasn't right. I said, I'm the one who's been doing this. Why didn't he tell me? Swami said, did you ask? I said, no. I just assumed that if it was true yesterday, it would be true today. And then that's all he had to say to me. And I said, no. And then I laughed, like, okay, this is fine. It's not that you dig the plant up and look at the roots every day to see if it's growing. And then this is what happened for me. I finally said that I had had so much energy focused toward this. And I got to the point where I said to Swami, I really don't mind losing. It's fine. If we just lose, it's no problem. But they were so awful, the people who opposed us. I really don't like that they won. And then oddly, I got a very high fever, which was very unusual for me. I got a high fever for a few days. When I got it from the fever, I didn't care. But I had to ask myself, and here's the point. It's an entertaining story, and it was definitely memorable. What am I really doing? Because I had become quite involved in winning that project. But what I really was doing was what Swamiji had asked me to do. Now, of course, that was a very direct request on his part, but this is what happens to us. We feel that something is right to do, and so we give all our energy to it. But then very often what happens is we lose track of what we're actually doing. Am I actually trying to make this project a success, or am I actually trying to live according to what will draw me into the light? And when that shifts on us, and it can shift in my case because Swamiji got an attunement with Master that I didn't have, but it can happen because the potential of what you're doing collapses, or people die, or someone betrays you and suddenly everything is different. So what am I really doing with my life? Am I really trying to make this thing happen and that thing happen and this thing happen? Or am I trying to live according to what God sends me to do and to be always in tune with His light? Keep your priorities straight and keep your mind clear about how they're going to express and what they're going to be. And the trick on this is, you see, that doesn't mean that you're uncommitted. It actually allows you to be committed on a much greater level because you have nothing to lose. If what we're thinking about is whether what we're doing works in this world, then we're always a little anxious because this world is so unreliable, just so exceedingly unreliable. There's so many forces beyond us, and those vrittis, we just don't know. We don't know what the next karmic thing is going to be. But God is always with us, and the Guru is always with us. And they never change in their relationship to us. And so what we have to cultivate on the deepest level, by every trick that you can imagine, is to make sure that we're operating in cooperation with their reality. A friend of mine who was very successful at business, he just had a intuition for always knowing what the next trend would be. And he was devoted to Jesus. That was his spiritual path. And in his office, in his company, he always had a chair sort of fairly close to him, but very inconveniently situated for anyone else to sit in. So even when there was a meeting, nobody ever sat in that chair because Jesus sat in that chair. And when he was ever doing anything, whether he was alone or anyone else was in the room, he was always in conversation. That was his real boss. You know, what should we do? And it was never an I. It was always, what should we do? And you see, nothing, absolutely nothing, can ever take that away from us. We can always be secure in that. However, sometimes he takes us places we'd rather not go. And that's where the difficulty comes. You know, we have an idea of what this itinerary is. Well, we have it pretty much mapped out. But we really don't know. Yesterday evening, some of you were here when we were talking downstairs, and someone asked what it was like to be with Swamiji. And, you know, there's a million things that one could say. And Keshava and I, who both served as Swami Kriyananda's secretary for a number of years, I had the job first, then Swami eased me out and brought Keshava in, which fortunately our friendship was strong enough to endure that. But Swami did it because I had other things I needed to do. But we both were talking about a characteristic that Swami had. I worked for Swami. He paid me, actually, literally, he paid me cash out of his wallet because things were very informal. He would just open his wallet, and I got a giant $50 from him every month, which was enough. It was just fine. And he knew that I had no priority except whatever he wanted from me. My friend Seva and I would go over to his house at 4 p.m. every day. This was when no internet, no telephones, no mail delivery to his house. So we were in the area where there was the telephone and the mail delivery, and so we'd come over every afternoon and tell him what had happened and deliver his mail and all that. We would go over at 4, sometimes be out the door by 4:30, sometimes we'd be there past midnight or later than that, just depending. So I never made any plans ever because there was nothing else I wanted to do. It's very simple. But every time when we'd come over, which we did every day, Swami would be like genuinely surprised to see us. Just, you know, like, oh, there you are. And he would sometimes say, "To what do I owe the honor of your company?" It was a very flowery phrase. Well, because we come over every day, sir, that's what. But it wasn't an attitude that he put on or anything like that. And I actually discussed it with him at one point. I talked to him about, like, this seems, and I said, I have the feeling that you follow the advice that you give us, which is our lives are just loaned to us by the divine. And everything that's in it, the people that we love, the successes that we've had, the talents, they're all just on loan to us to use for our own salvation and for the upliftment of the world. And Swami says every night, mentally make a bonfire and put everything in it. Burn up all your attachments, burn up all your expectations before you go to sleep. And then when you wake up each day, you're free again. And I said, I feel like you just let us go every night. And so if we're still there the next day, it's a genuine gift from God. It's an affirmation that maybe this is going to continue. He just said yes. You know, nothing like even like it was unusual. It was just like yes. And even in working with us, he would never directly say, do this, ever. He would always make it so that and Kesava was confirming the same thing. I mean, I worked for him. I was his secretary. But it was always my choice as to whether or not I was going to help him. And he would, bring things up in a way that just gave me the option to say no. I typed his manuscript. It was when he wrote his Path, The Path, because it was the last book he wrote before he had a computer. So I typed the book, and unfortunately he got a computer after that. But he would say something like, I had a very productive day. And what that meant was that there was a lot of paper over here that could be typed. Or he said, I was writing such and so chapter and it was very interesting, which also meant that you'll enjoy it when you read it. But it wasn't calculated. He was just, he was talking about it. And then that gave me the chance to say, oh, would you like me to type the manuscript? Oh, that would be so helpful. This is freedom. This is really how we live. Nobody owes us anything. They just don't. We owe God everything for the gift of our lives. We have to be appropriate in how we express it. We have to use our common sense and our good intelligence. But why are we here? And what are we really attached to? Be attached, fiercely attached, to following, to expressing the Master's presence within us, and to listening, and to asking. And it's not like, as I said, you have to pull the plant up every day. We get going in a direction, self-evidently the right direction. You give birth to children, you get married, you start an enterprise, you're painting a picture. It's important to finish. You can't just frivolously do this and do that. But why are we doing it? Just ask yourself over and over again. And then actually just one more very serious thought here. If we really know that Master loves us, the Gurus are with us, and that everything happens by the will of God, why are we afraid? And that's a particular. I'm very sensitive. So the inclination to not be courageous in the face of trials, and to be nervous about things that happen is a karma that I personally have had to struggle with. But so often, if you trace everything back, why am I afraid? A very wonderful meditation, and not one that you can just settle in 15 minutes, but just whenever anxiety and nervousness comes to us, or concern that isn't productive, just ask yourself, why am I afraid? What am I worried about? And why am I worried about it? And sometimes we have to trace that really deeply, because we'll say something obvious. Well, I'm afraid my child will die. I'm afraid I'll get sick. But why am I afraid of that? What is it that's really making me anxious? Because, truthfully, if you follow it all the way down, it's always that we think that God is not taking care of us. We think that somehow everything happens by the will of God except this little piece. And once I was in a situation where someone that I loved very much was suffering a great deal in a hospital. And the role that I had to play in the situation was to try to give strength to others. But I had reached the limit of my capacity, so I went out. I'm sure the parking lot of hospitals has seen a lot of tears. So I got into my car, alone in my car where nobody was watching me, and I was able to just give vent to my suffering, my despair over what was happening. I was just so upset. And then this thought came into my head. It came in my right ear and it percolated through my brain and it went out my left ear. And it said, could this possibly be happening outside the will of God? Now, there's many things that were important about that moment. It was like, that was a moment of very intense personal crisis for me. But I had been practicing when it was easier. This is an advice Swami gave me once. You have to practice when it's easier. You can't just wait till your life is on the line to find out whether or not you have faith in God. You have to be practicing all the time. There's never a moment when you can be imagining something else. You have to always be realizing, every time a situation upsets you, every time something small happens, could this be happening outside the will of God? That I was going to make scrambled eggs for breakfast and there's no eggs because my roommate ate all the eggs, whatever it might be, where there's some part of you wants to rebel. We have to practice when it's easier. So I'm there and the thought comes. And because I had spent so many years persuading myself that everything happens by the will of God, even in that moment, I just saw this comical picture where you see the whole tapestry of creation and then somebody's taken a pair of scissors and cut this little square out. Everything happens by the will of God except not this. And it was just preposterous. But I wanted to rebel against it, but because I'd practiced when it was easier, I just couldn't. My integrity couldn't reject that thought. Then I also discovered something that was very helpful, which is that we can be completely sincere. We don't have to pretend. I said, well, Lord, if this is your will, I don't approve. I think this is awful. And I think that you really need to do something about this. And I just said, I need you to change this because I can't handle this anymore. And of course, Master says you can make demands of God. And one of the reasons he says that God is pleased when you do that, because you don't make demands of someone unless you trust them. So when we feel that we can honestly be ourselves, it's very pleasing to God because that means you trust me, doesn't it? So I did. I just said, I'm going down. I don't think I have the strength to continue. And I walked back into the hospital. Everything turned for the better. I just went right back in like, what do you know? It doesn't always happen like that, but it did that time. And so we practice when it's easier, so that when the force gets stronger against us, we have someplace to stand. And we understand what we're attached to. Not to this, but to that. Later, when my parents were aging and I was having difficulty dealing with what happened, they've been gone from this world for 20 years now. I shifted the prayer into this. Lord, whatever you're trying to teach them, you need to help them to learn it and fast. But why would we not want people to learn what they're supposed to learn? And how often does our learning come through suffering? So what am I really attached to? You see, just asking the question and practicing when it's easier. So I think that's enough. We have time for a question or two, if someone has one that they would like to ask. That's the question I always get when I come to this country, which is, I'm a householder, I have so many duties, how can I add in all these spiritual practices? I can't put down my householder duties. Of course, is it possible that the life you've been given is outside the will of God? Is it possible that the only place that God is present is in these four walls and He's not present in your house? Is it possible that the opportunity you have to serve in that way isn't the appropriate karma for you? We have to sort of ask all these questions. So we have to start with realizing that whatever apparent conflict I'm facing has to have a resolution, because the nature of the divine is that everything resolves in harmony sooner or later. So first of all, one should not use any energy in rebellion against the circumstances that we're in. But it's also fair to say, this is, I've been doing this for 25 years and I'm ready to do something else, or this isn't really feeding me the way the other reality is feeding me. So how are we going to resolve this? And really be very honest with the divine, and we have to be very creative on the spiritual path. And sometimes we have to displease people we'd rather not displease. So sometimes we have to ask ourselves, what is the real karma here? Is the karma that I actually have to continue in exactly the same way, or is the fact that I now have another priority pushing me to take a stand, to claim an energy, to make a shift that nobody around me is necessarily going to support, except that I know it's the right thing that I should do. And then we also sometimes we have to raise our energy, which is to say that we have to just find a way to do a little more than we were doing before. We also have to ask ourselves whether everything I'm doing is really essential, or whether it's just what everyone around me has been accustomed to my doing. Is this really what is essential for me to do? Swamiji he called it putting a rock in the river. Instead of just having the river just continue to flow, you just place a rock in the river and then let the river move around it. And sometimes there'll be a little turbulence when you first do that. And I know one of the karmas of being born in India is that your life belongs to everybody else. I was not born in India. But I actually, when I was first here, and I would hear this repeatedly, my family, my children, my in-laws, my this, my that. And I asked those who'd been here longer, I said, what did Swami say when people would come to him like that? And he would say, what I was inclined to say was, it's your life, it's not theirs. Now that doesn't mean you have to be selfish and inconsiderate, but I think the karma sometimes in this culture is that enough already. Human birth is something, but divine birth is everything. And this whole situation that we find ourselves in one body, is just one body. And who am I really, and what is forward progress for me? That's the question. What is forward progress for me? Forward progress for me. That's the question. What is forward progress for me? No, I'm not suggesting you disassociate yourself from it, but I'm saying that you just stand back a little bit and think, what could change in this situation that could give me more opportunity to nurture my soul, that will not really injure or deprive the people that I have to take care of. I totally understand that this is tough, but if one finds oneself where there's a huge conflict between the expectations of others, the habits of a lifetime, and an awakening call to deeper spiritual practice, especially when one is not young and one is moving toward the end of this life, yeah, you have to ask the question. And there's no dogma. There's no dogma that can be answered here. It may be that you simply infuse your ordinary life with the devotion for God and everything stays exactly the same. It may be that certain decisions have to be made, and they should be made carefully and thoughtfully. But to imagine that one has no choices is simply not true. One always has choices. I remember I have this little book, actually, Ask Asha. Is it up here? Yeah, Ask Asha. And these are real questions from people. I got a question from a woman in India about her idea of who she wanted to marry versus the husband that her family had selected for her, and she didn't really want to marry him. It's an interesting question in there. You can just open the book and find it. And she told me that she had to go along with her parents. I wrote to her and I said, no, actually, I said, you're over 21, you have a job, you have a passport. I said, but it would be highly inconvenient for you not to go along. And highly inconvenient is not the same as not possible. And so what we have to do is we have to, and then you have to make a value judgment. You have to decide what, who am I? What is my karma? What can really be done? And I have to stand back, and I full disclosure, this is not a battle that I've had to fight in this lifetime. I believe I've fought it in other lifetimes. But I know the principles that you always have choices. But it depends on what the price of that choice is and what the right choice is. So greatly sympathetic, but also realize, this is the karma that I have, isn't it? That I suddenly want to do something that really contradicts what I've always done and what everybody expects of me. Highly inconvenient. Yeah. Okay, is that fair enough? The question being, how do you maintain your faith in the Lord when times get difficult? And times may get much more difficult. You have to practice when it's easier. That really is the same answer. Because I asked Swami a question, and the question had to do with, catastrophic conditions in which an instant decision had to be made to throw my life away. It was theoretical, but it was very intense to me. Throw my life away in what may be a lost cause, or protect myself. It was just, like, what do you do? And he said, practice when it's easier. You're asking in a moment of crisis, how can you know what God wants? And he said, the only way you'll know at that moment is if you've practiced when it was easier. And so what we need to do, especially now when we can see how uncertain the world is, and this is also an answer to the question, my household duties prevent me from doing much spiritual practice. I don't know. What are your real household duties? Is to be strong for your family and to be able to help the ones that you love. And if spiritual practice will give you a much greater capacity to genuinely serve them, what is your duty? And right now, when times are difficult and increasingly difficult, we need to practice when it's easier. We need to constantly be looking inward and upward toward the divine and immersing ourselves as much as we are able in the vibration of the masters, so that when a crisis comes to us, that's where we go. And we have to examine our fears and go deeper and deeper into those fears and find the bedrock of faith, or build a bedrock of faith. This is not we did not choose an easy time to be born. There were yugas where everything just rolled along. We're not in one of those. But it must have been a good idea for us to come, or else we wouldn't have. Can this be happening outside the will of God? Get yourself a few mantras that work for you, and use them. Use them all the time. And then that you'll find that you have built the muscle for when it's really hard.